Russia hopes to establish a, quote, reliable security architecture in the Asia-Pacific region. This is according to its leader Vladimir Putin during last week's state visits to Vietnam and to North Korea, where he penned a defense pact with Kim Jong-un. So what are the broader implications of this military agreement? What are the prospects of South Korea providing Ukraine with lethal weapons? And what has been the response to Moscow's courting of Hanoi? Hope your work week is off to a good start. You're watching Issues and Insiders for this Monday, June 24th. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we touch upon Russian leader Vladimir Putin's visits to North Korea and Vietnam last week. And for this, I have our panel of foreign correspondents. I have Thomas Maresca with the American news agency United Press International. Thomas, welcome back.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for having me.
I also have Frank Smith, a freelance foreign journalist based here in Korea, who is also, I understand, lecturing at Yonsei University. Frank, it's good to have you with us.
Nice to be back again, Sunhee.
Right, Thomas, let's start with details about the defense deal sealed between North Korea and Russia and its broader implications.
Yep, so North Korea and Russia signed a new treaty on comprehensive strategic partnership during Putin's visit to Pyongyang last week. And, you know, the article that got just probably the most attention, and I think caught a lot of people by surprise, actually, was this defense clause in it that said, if one country is attacked, the other would come to their military aid sort of without delay. I think right now, the world is trying to sort out what exactly that entails. I mean, there seems to be some sort of wiggle room about, that also mentions under Article 51 of the UN Charter and the laws of each country. So it's not necessarily, saying, oh, there will be definite automatic response if, there's shots fired in the DMZ or something like that. But I think, at the very least, it sort of indicates that, on the one hand, North Korea, it sort of sets the stage for North Korea to continue and perhaps expand its, weapons supplies to Russia for its war in the Ukraine. I mean, when Putin was asked, he was in Vietnam after North Korea and asked by some Russian journalists about whether sort of Western-supplied weapons being used by Ukraine against Russia would be considered an act of aggression. He didn't say, definitely yes, but sort of said, yeah, we're looking at that. It seems quite close. So he sort of seemed to set the table for that as a pretext. And then he also, in the same breath, kind of mentioned that Russia would very much consider selling weapons or supplying North Korea with weapons under the same sort of umbrella, which has, clearly caused a good deal of alarm in this side of the world. We've known for a while that, it seems that Russia would be trading maybe military technology or sort of space technology to North Korea to advance its own, weapons and missile programs. This seemed to kind of make that a bit more explicit as a possibility. I think also it just kind of lays out that, both sides are going all in on this sort of agreement. For a while there's this sense of, oh, it's a, just sort of convenience for both sides. But it seems like, they both have fully invested in this idea of us against the world. I mean, there's language in this partnership too about, sort of the unilateral sanctions regime imposed by the hegemonic West, and we're sort of striking back against that. So, you can see that seems to be more of a strategic, maybe long-term alliance than, or, not necessarily alliance, but, some sort of arrangement. I think it sort of also underscores how desperate in a way Putin is, or how limited his options are. I mean, he hasn't been to North Korea since 2000 until now, so it gives you an idea of how important, he thought it was until then. But along with that desperation, I think there's a sense of real danger afoot, between both of these. Both of these countries are so isolated and in some senses have less to lose, that there's also, I think this heightens the sense of perhaps danger.
Right, and keeping in mind what Thomas has just said, Frank, how worried do you suppose should the international community be about this military pact between North Korea and Russia?
I think the international community, in a sense, we're talking about the U.S. and its allies in Europe and its allies here in East Asia and around the world. And there's hardly consensus over what that might be. When you look at the UN Security Council, you have two countries, China and Russia, that we wouldn't consider the international community in terms of concern here, but certainly the U.S. and its allies should be worried about this, and especially Article 4 that Thomas alluded to, that suggested that they would come to each other's aid with whatever means in case the other country was in a state of war. Now, the Korean War ended with an armistice, not a peace treaty. Russia is a nuclear power with thousands of nuclear weapons, with whatever means. Does that mean that Russia has potentially or could potentially extend the nuclear umbrella, extended deterrence to North Korea, the same extended deterrence, the nuclear umbrella that the U.S. extends to South Korea? Does this mean that now Kim Jong-un has Russia's nuclear weapon to serve as cover for his provocative behavior, for example, along the DMZ that we've seen over the past few months? NK News, analyzing satellite imagery of the military demarcation line, the actual border within the DMZ, indicated that North Korea had crossed that line repeatedly to develop better anti-tank barriers, and were destroying what had previously been railways between North Korea and South Korea, restructuring its defensive positions again within that disputed area. North Korean soldiers were even killed by mines that exploded there. Just a reminder, this is the largest mined area, hundreds of thousands of landmines along this area that, again, North Korea feels it has carte blanche cover to go in there and essentially move the border further south, it appears. This could have huge ramifications. Prior to this security pact, and I think it's fair to call it an alliance at this point, in South Korean state media, it said that they did not anticipate there being an alliance aspect to any of the documents that the two of them may sign. So this essentially alliance agreement has really taken the so-called international community, the U.S. and its allies here in South Korea and Japan, by surprise. And certainly analysts within government and outside of government are struggling really to analyze all of this. Just today, and for example, in the Korea Herald, I read an article that suggested now, Kim Jong-un has not only has cover to engage in more provocative behavior towards South Korea, but that Putin would welcome that kind of behavior because it would distract the U.S. and Europe perhaps from what's going on in Ukraine. The ramifications of this treaty can be very, very far-reaching. And I think analysts, again, inside and outside of government around the world are going to have to take some time to really digest all of this.
Right. And speaking about Ukraine, Thomas, South Korea, in response to the pledge of greater partnership, military partnership between North Korea and Russia, South Korea has signaled a potential shift in its support policy for Ukraine. What do you believe are the prospects of South Korea shipping weapons to Ukraine?
Right. Well, the National Security Advisor Chang Ho-jin mentioned that in the aftermath of the Putin-Kim summit that he condemned the partnership, but he mentioned that South Korea planned to review its policy of providing lethal aid to Ukraine, and up until now, Seoul has avoided directly supplying lethal aid, under this kind of blanket policy of not supplying weapons to countries at war. And, it's something that just in general, I think the idea, we even saw it, it kind of came out in those leaked documents, last year among internal discussions. But, we know that Seoul has been hesitant to sort of fully commit to supplying weapons directly for fear of, just burning bridges with Russia or further, provoking Russia. South Korea is in a particular position in the world where obviously, you have a lot of factors to consider, just geographically and size and everything wise. I mean, we know that South Korea has shipped ammunition to the U.S. that, kind of maybe it was replenishing the stockpiles from the U.S. sending, and South Korea has sent weapons to Poland that, found their way to the battlefield. But, this would be really a firm step that South Korea has been hesitant to take until now. I don't think they're going to do it tomorrow. I mean, the way it was sort of framed has been, it would be in response to what Russia does. I mean, if Russia starts heavily arming North Korea, you could make a credible case for why. But, I think South Korea still is having to weigh these kind of costs and benefits of taking such an action. I mean, one side of it is, you would want as much security guarantee from the U.S. as possible if you were going to sort of fully jump on board with that. And I mean, I think the looming election in November kind of creates a sort of a sense of uncertainty about what to expect maybe going forward. If there is a change in administration, how is that going to affect, the U.S. policy towards Ukraine? And, I've already seen questions arising again, the sense of should South Korea be looking to develop its own nuclear arsenal? How much can South Korea really rely on the U.S. in these cases? I would say at the same time, the calculation also is if South Korea's providing weapons could be seen as really tipping the balance one way on the battlefield, where a case where it's not just sort of helping Ukraine hold things off, but, Ukraine winning the war or something. I mean, that's a strategic interest probably to South Korea in terms of its own security, benefits of Putin taking that defeat and how that might spill over to North Korea. So I think, there's a lot that, a lot of steps that have to take place before we see it. But it does feel like it's more on the table and out there than it had been until now.
Right. In the meantime, Frank, Russia's Vladimir Putin has said that South Korea's provision of weapons, lethal weapons that is, to Ukraine would be a very big mistake. What actions might Putin resort to in the case of weapons shipments from South Korea to Ukraine, do you think?
Well, just before I get to that, I'd like to spin off of what some things that Thomas mentioned. South Korea's provision of lethal aid to Ukraine, again, is certainly something that Putin is going to look at very negatively. And it would be easy for Putin and for Russia to determine that kind of aid. It would see it on the battlefield. It might have, satellite surveillance of these transfers take place. Whereas Russia's cooperation with North Korea in terms of what Putin might give North Korea through this alliance and through North Korea's provision of lethal aid to Russia for its use in Ukraine is probably going to be a little bit more difficult to pinpoint. It will involve, for example, satellite technology and missile technology. Just 9 months ago, Kim Jong-un held a summit in Russia's Far East with Putin. He visited the Vostochny Cosmodrome, where he learned more about Russia's missile technology. Intelligence sources suggest that there is cooperation in terms of the manufacture of engine technology for their missiles, as well as, possibly satellite technology. And then on the nuclear end of things, in terms of energy, powering, for example, North Korean submarines, that enables North Korean submarines to move more freely without being surveilled that easily. That could have ramifications for South Korea and the United States. And then nuclear energy, just domestic nuclear energy cooperation between Russia and North Korea would be problematic because that's how North Korea obtains fissile material for its nuclear weapons program. And then just on the conventional weapons sphere and the physical weapons sphere, there could be increased cooperation from Russia to North Korea and even on the nuclear technology sphere. So the range of areas that Russia can help North Korea in terms of its security situation, its security circumstances, its military hardware, its weapons is quite broad and certainly worrisome for the U.S. and its allies.
Right. Thomas, following his trip to North Korea last Wednesday, Putin made his way to Vietnam. What are the broader implications, you suppose, of Moscow's courting, so to speak, of Hanoi, do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting trip. I mean, I think on the one hand, it was just a chance for Putin to kind of get out of his international isolation. There's not that many places he can actually go these days. The International Criminal Court has a warrant out for him, and Vietnam is one country that's not party to that. Vietnam and Russia have a very long and sort of very close history. I mean, I think Russia is certainly in the Soviet days and the post-Vietnam War, even during the war with the French by Vietnam, Russia was Vietnam's biggest supporter, biggest patron, and there's a long and kind of fond history. I mean, a lot of Russian or Vietnamese leaders studied in Russia during the time, so there's a kind of a closeness there. And there was, there were a bunch of agreements signed during the trip, but nothing as meaningful, I think, as this defense pact. Russia and Vietnam certainly have some still mutual interests. I mean, Russia has been traditionally Vietnam's largest weapons supplier. I mean, Vietnam is not supposed to be buying more weapons from Russia these days, but a huge part of their arsenal comes from Russia, so they kind of still need to maintain that relationship. Vietnam and Russia have joint ventures in oil and gas exploration that is important to both. I mean, I think for Vietnam, maybe having Russia as a bit of a wedge against China in the South China Sea, where there are territorial disputes over their oil exploration, is something that's helpful to them. But for Vietnam, it's often called this bamboo diplomacy. They have this stance towards we'll bend with we'll work with everybody and kind of bend but not break in terms of our relationships. And Vietnam has greatly strengthened its ties with the U.S. Just within the last year, they raised the level of their partnership. Vietnam has deep, economic ties and other ties with China as well. So, it's something for them to try and navigate. I mean, and obviously the importance of the amount of trade that Vietnam has with the U.S. and with China massively dwarfs what amount of trade they have with Russia. And I think the U.S. was clearly not super happy about just sort of the way Vietnam rolled out the red carpet for Putin. I mean, the embassy there spoke against it. I mean, Washington didn't say too much about it, but then really the day after Putin was there, the U.S. sent Assistant Secretary of State Daniel Crittenbrink there, and they made a statement, both sides, about how important this relationship was. I think, again, it probably, to some extent, it underscores how narrow Putin's world really is. Like, these are the places he can go, and I mean, he obviously does still want to maintain a sort of, as you mentioned at the top, some security alliance within Asia or some security presence here. But, we can see Putin doesn't have that many places to go. I think for Vietnam, it may underscore how things go, and they may have to take more of a stand, maybe one way or the other in the future. Or is it possible to maintain this kind of three-way fence sitting or multilateral fence sitting indefinitely? So I think it has ended up raising some questions for what Vietnam may have to confront going forward as well.
Right. And broadly speaking then, Frank, what has been the international community's response to Putin's engagement with his counterparts in Pyongyang and Hanoi?
Well, again, spinning back to what Thomas said, I think we can sort of set the Hanoi visit aside and concentrate really on the reaction of Putin's visit to Pyongyang. And it was pretty much negative all the way around, the U.S. and its allies, with the U.S. and South Korea coming out with a statement today condemning this developing alliance. Also, you had the United Nations Security Council, or the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, saying that Russia should abide by United Nations Security Council sanctions. Now, those sanctions suggest that countries should not help North Korea with military trade. Doing so is violating United Nations Security Council sanctions, which Russia signed on to. I think really this has to be a wake-up call for the U.S. and its allies in the international community about a number of issues. One of them, the UN Security Council itself. I hold a a UN Security Council emergency mock session at Yonsei Graduate School each year. And the students choose the subject. And this year it was, okay, we can talk about the war in Gaza, we can talk about the war in Ukraine. And then students suggested, let's talk about reforming the UN Security Council because it's not functioning. And I think that was the case here, you know, and we can dial this back to blatant violations of international law that the United States has engaged in, going back to the Iraq War and currently, you know, the way the UN Security Council is functioning vis-a-vis Israel's war and arguably genocide on the Palestinians. When that is let slide, or when the UN Security Council fails to act in that regard, Russia's behavior in Ukraine or North Korea's alliance with Russia, you know, you're going to have more difficulty there. And then if we dial things back further to 2018, 2019, Moon Jae-in laid engagement with North Korea on a silver platter for former U.S. President Donald Trump. And in 2019, at the behest of his national security advisor, John Bolton, he, you know, gave that up and really sabotaged the potential to engage North Korea, be it perhaps a flawed arms agreement or a flawed peace treaty with North Korea. If that had to happen then, if there was some type of engagement between or locked in agreement between
Right.
North Korea and the U.S. and the international community, we probably wouldn't be where we are now. So really, we have to view this as a wake-up call for the international community.
Well, for sure, the defense deal between North Korea and Russia, the latest one, is raising quite a bit of concern here. And as you mentioned earlier, Frank, analysts are still trying to assess what the implications of that deal may be. For today, though, that's where we'll have to end this talk. Frank, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Thomas here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching.